Raised and born on an island, you might think that the entire world was your island. And so you might have a word that you would use, the world. And then at some point, when you figured out that there were other continents and other islands and other lands for you to explore, your definition of what the world is would expand. This is kind of what's happened with the universe. As we've explored more, we've discovered that we're probably best off, it would be ideal, based on the actual transliteration of universe or its origins, if we used it to describe everything and instead used a condensed label like our local universe or our real space-time, but we don't. And that's why we draw a distinction between the universe and the cosmos. Now, contingency arguments merely assert that the explanation for the universe must be a being and a necessary non-contingent one. They don't ever demonstrate this in any way, nor do they demonstrate that this being explanation must be one in which this being still exists, the difference between a causal contingency and a sustaining contingency. Why is that? I mean, after all, they believe in a God that exists. I mean, these arguments aren't just coming from deistic notions, even though they are all consistent with a deistic notion of a God. These are quite often fundamentalist Christians, evangelical Christians, moderate Christians, seminarians, apologists, all who believe in Jesus. These are also arguments coming from Muslims to argue for their God. How is it that these different religions can use the same argument for the existence of God and yet believe in different gods? Now, this isn't an argument in any way to show that they're wrong. If there was in fact a God, arguments for the existence of God would apply to all the religions that would point to a similar God. This is an expression of the concern that I have that people aren't defending the God they believe in. And when they instead offer arguments like this, like the argument from contingency, the Kalam cosmological argument, things like this, not only are they not arguing for the God that they actually believe in, but the argument that they're presenting doesn't get us to a God exists. The conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument, for example, is not therefore God exists, it is therefore the universe has a cause. And the conclusion of the versions of the argument from contingency, while they might be God exists, we can see that there's a disconnect between there is some non-contingent thing that it serves as an ultimate foundation. And this idea that the non-contingent thing that serves as an ultimate foundation is a thinking being that they're going to call God, and then they're going to extrapolate from that down to the particular God they believe in the religious doctrine.
Okay, lots of points here. What are your thoughts, Josh?
Well, I essentially think that what Matt is doing here is shifting the goalposts with the argument or his critique, because what essentially he's saying, and I think if I'm categorizing correctly, is just saying, well, this cosmological argument or this contingency argument isn't pointing towards a specific Christian God or the specific Muslim God. Well, that's never been the point of the contingency argument in the first place. The contingency argument is only to prove the existence of a God, not to prove the existence of a specific God. I don't think in the history of philosophy itself has anyone said, oh, this proves Jesus Christ or has proved Islam or proved Allah or something like that, right? I don't necessarily think that anyone's ever said that. Of course, Aquinas does say that this thing is that which we most resemble God, but even then he doesn't necessarily point it directly to the Christian God. And if they do, I do think they are mistaken. So I think that by asking for these arguments to point directly to the Christian God would just be shifting the goalposts and demanding of them something that they never even tried to argue for in the first place, which I think is just not necessarily something which is a very good way to approach these arguments in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I generally agree with you. I do think it's helpful, though, to think about like the purpose of arguments, because I think sometimes people do use these arguments as weapons. Like, you know, like a Christian will use the Kalam and just like try to hammer it on the atheist and be like, see, you believe a universe comes from nothing, and da da da, which is like, it's kind of rough on. It's kind of unfair. But like arguments shouldn't necessarily be like weapons where we try to like prove our worldviews, but really like tools for discovery. So at least like when I think about the contingency argument, like I'm thinking about like, well, yeah, it makes sense that there has to be something like that's the foundation. And well, what's the foundation? Well, I'm going to think that the most likely foundation, like the candidate, is like a mind that's perfect, like a God. So I think of it more as a tool to just try to like understand the world rather than like a weapon where I'm just out to try to prove God exists. So I think there's that. And then obviously, like, you know, like we're going to interpret in our worldviews. Like no atheist is going to accept the conclusion God exists, or they wouldn't be an atheist. And the same reason, like a theist isn't going to accept an argument with the conclusion that God doesn't exist, or they'd be an atheist. So yeah, I don't know. It's just, it's important to think about the nature of arguments.
I think your point on the nature of arguments is just fascinating. It's like, well, what exactly is the purpose of arguments? And you're like, well, it's to discover, it's to move towards something new. And I think that's just so beautiful. It's kind of how we have, and this is seen in Joe Schmidt's channel, like there's like stage 1 and stage 2 cosmological or contingency arguments. We first argue towards a necessary foundation, and then we argue for, well, what exactly is this necessary foundation? Because like in the past, a lot of the arguments against kind of contingency arguments was to argue that there cannot be a necessary foundation. Russell is trying to say, well, that's a brute fact. It's not a god. Or Hume would sometimes say, well, there is no necessary foundation because it just goes back ad infinitum. But then now we have more atheist philosophers who have gone further, gone from just denying contingency arguments as a whole to just denying stage 2 of the argument and accepting stage 1. So I think this idea of everyone trying to explore the same kind of world or understanding more about the truth is just so fascinating. And finally, a thing that I perhaps would like to say about what he discussed about, I think it was the sustaining cause of the universe. I don't necessarily think that that is something which is necessarily, or as we've said before, has to be held. He said something like the sustaining cause of the universe or the contingency argument is based on the sustaining cause, and that sustaining cause is important for people's belief in God. I don't necessarily think that's the case. In fact, I think that the cause of the contingency argument is to point towards a being which would entail the falsity of atheism. It would be a really weird form of atheism to believe that there was a God which just stopped causing the universe like 5 days ago or even 5 million years ago. I mean, I would not necessarily classify them as an atheist. As a result, I don't necessarily think that this kind of, even if you do just accept that there is a necessary cause or a causal contingency, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is now no God at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree with you a lot. I do think it's important to like remember the tools idea I brought up, because like obviously, like I'm a Christian and I'm like a Christian apologist. Like it doesn't mean that I think all arguments for God are good, and that doesn't mean I think that like all arguments for atheism are bad. Like I just did a video like why I'm a Christian, just talking about like my own thoughts on like the different kinds of arguments and whatnot. So yeah.